It's taken as kind of an academic commonplace that chant scholarship since the 1950s has focused on how chant has come to be in the obscure period before fully notated music. This concerns what musicologist James McKinnon has referred to as the central question of Gregorian chant, and Kenneth Levy summarizes that, quote, the nature and substance of the music during its oral transmission and the circumstances of its writing down have ever since the 1950s been high on the Gregorianist agenda. The most influential and powerful accounts of Gregorian chant emergence come from this need to posit a mechanism for chant creation and transmission during the age of orality. These theories tend to focus on how, thus, chant was transmitted, what kinds of mechanisms were used in order to have it disseminated from Rome to the Frankish north and to create this kind of new musical experience. The broader question of why has received comparatively little attention. Though certainly not completely ignored, it has nonetheless been sidelined within musicology, possibly because of concerns that such a topic is a little bit out of the focus of musicological scholarship, as well as a very healthy skepticism of just how much one can actually say about why without resorting to sheer speculation. When the question of why is usually broached, there's a couple of general narratives that we all know. The narrative concerning how it was politically motivated, Charlemagne and broadly speaking, the Carolingian dynasty needed to unify their political power and thus accepted the liturgy from Rome. There's also motivation that was possibly completely religious. You know, there's many accounts of how much Charlemagne wanted to be thought of as a good Christian king, this sort of thing. Though these accounts are certainly true, I want to add something of a thicker description to this emergence narrative by hopefully revealing the conceptual underpinnings that may have influenced the development of Gregorian chant. Furthermore, I argue that rather than a simple contextualization of chant's historical background, this understanding is vital for musicologists because it provides insight into chant's genesis. Again, the question, even from a musical perspective, is neither what nor how, but why. Why did Gregorian chant emerge in this manner and not others? And why did it take on the distinctive musical characteristics that make it Gregorian chant versus some other kind of chant repertoire? In order to do this, I want to focus on a particular kind of conceptualization, and that is the conceptualization of memory. Carruthers' scholarship, which I'm taking as my kind of starting point, argues that Western European pre-modern life, extending back to the classical Greeks, was organized around the use of memory. Furthermore, this use was consciously regulated as both a mental conceptualization and practical technique. In addressing the fundamental nature of memory, Carruthers states, quote, it is my contention that medieval culture was fundamentally memorial, to the same profound degree that modern culture in the West is documentary. This distinction certainly involves technologies, mnemonic techniques, and printing, but it is not confined to them, for the valuing of memoria persisted long after book technology itself had changed. According to Carruthers, part of the ubiquity of memorial techniques within medieval culture, and thus their wide influence, was because they were fully institutionalized in education, being transmitted in the writings of famous authors such as Quintilian, St. Augustine, etc. This longevity of memoria's importance in medieval culture suggests that we need to take it into account when thinking of what sort of conceptual background Gregorian chant emerged from. So if we're going to do this, we need to discuss some of the main differences between memoria as conceived in the Middle Ages and how we might think of memory now. The two most telling differences between memory as we conceive it now as opposed to the Middle Ages is first, that in the Middle Ages, memory was conceived as primarily constructive, imaginative, and productive. The second is that memory was conceived as intrinsically somatic. The first function can be understood as an extension of a greater medieval mindset concerning composition. As musicologist Nancy Van Dusen has recently suggested, medieval composition, whether in the case of music or rhetorical composition, was centered around the idea of dividing an idea or an object into usable parts or chunks and reconstructing these chunks in a meaningful way. Memory is then configured as a way to store up these chunks of material for later use. Indeed, there is a distinction between mere verbatim recall and recollection, where recollection, as the English word literally implies, recollects the pieces of memory to be assembled in some intelligible order. And finally, as this idea of chunking things up might suggest, there's a very spatial element to medieval memory, both in the sense of where memory is stored, but also in the necessity for the subject who is remembering to orientate themselves in regards to the object they're remembering. As Carruthers glosses, composition begins with clearly and deliberately locating oneself in a place, which may be an actual location, but is most importantly conceived of as a mental position, both a habitation for the mind and a direction. The second element of memory, its somatic nature, relates to the manner in which a subject's memorial archive is grown. Again, as Carruthers glosses, quote, "A work is not truly read until one has made it part of oneself." This incorporation, or making part of oneself, was described by several different metaphors governed by what was believed to be the physical process of memory formation. The most widely used image was that of wax tablets in which memory would be inscribed or impressed. This metaphor goes back at least as far as Plato, and there are some indications it may even be older. These memory impressions were considered images imprinted upon the memory. And the inscription and impression metaphors show that the process of memory, the process of this image impression, was thought to in some way to occupy space. They were literally incised and stamped onto matter. This physical stamping colors memory with a kind of radical embodiedness and physicality, because at least at some level, the object image literally becomes part of the subject. Furthermore, it is only through this incorporation that true knowledge and valuable knowledge can be gained. As St. Gregory kind of glosses, we ought to transform what we read within our very selves so that when our mind is stirred by what it hears, our life may concur by practicing what has been heard. Thus, memory becomes the mediating lens through which the subject both views his present and charts his future. It is important precisely because it shapes the subject, and it is in this way that memory becomes explicitly connected to identity formation, or character building, as they might say in the Middle Ages. However, interestingly, this formation is not merely a private matter. Scholarship that focuses on the idea of collective or corporate memory tends to be spearheaded by the Durkheim School of Sociology. They're usually accredited with thinking of collective memory in this sense, particularly Maurice Halbwachs. His basic formulation has an interesting resonance with medieval examples. Now, I'm not going to read that entire quote, but the important thing to take from it is at the end, and that is that it is to this degree that our individual thought places itself in these frameworks and participates in this memory, that is collective memory, that it is capable of the act of recollection at all. It's a very strong statement about how collective memory in general actually allows for personal subjective memory. Having established this background, Halbwachs goes on to apply this to society in general, and particularly religious societies, and he comes up with three important conclusions. One, religion enacts its own memory through ritual. It is by ritual that, in the present state, religions continue to enact their own history. Two, during times of social crisis or change, this collective memory must be increasingly stabilized if the group is going to maintain equilibrium. And three, turning to the Christian religion in particular, he suggests that this is vital due to Christianity's positioning as both a radically historical and radically eternal religion. And you can disagree with the statement perhaps, but he goes on to posit all these kind of binaries flowing from that. So contingent memory versus stabilized memory, and eventually he talks about theological mysticism versus dogmatic kind of theologies. It is at this point that I want to turn back to the Frankish dilemma, because I think between these two streams, the kind of collective memory scholarship and Carruthers' scholarship of memory in the Middle Ages, we see a common thread, that in both of them, identity is established through a kind of coherence of memory. I wish to suggest that, at least at one level, this was what was facing the Carolingians. Beneath the often biting accounts of who better performed the liturgy lies what could be considered something of an existential panic. The relatively young Carolingian dynasty and its rulers wished to be identified as Christian, and in an age where identity is tied so explicitly to memory, what better way to assert one's Christianness than to ally oneself with the copious memory of Rome? Yet, as Halbwachs suggested, in religion, the uniting of collective identity was one of ritual, and this is precisely what the Frankish North lacked. That is, while on the one hand they professed a unified Christian identity with Rome, on the other hand their rituals were quite different from Roman rituals, especially in the musical sense. What makes matters worse is by this disjunction, it seemed to be caused by the nature of the ritual itself. If we remember the famous quote from Isidore of Seville, "For unless sounds are held by the memory of man, they perish, because they cannot be written down." Thus, memory's necessity for the ontological stability of sound makes it unstable. Sound cannot be imaged the way that other memories could be, and what they thought was the first step in the memorial process couldn't even take place. I suggest that this crisis was one of the many factors explaining for the dogged determination by which the Carolingian monarchy attempted to acquire and transmit Roman liturgy in general, and chant in particular. However, what's interesting is I think it also gives us an insight into the question of why they solved the problem in the the way they did. Again, why did they create Gregorian chant? And I think to approach an answer to this, we now have to turn to an actual musical document, tonaries. Chant scholars have long been fascinated with tonaries, medieval documents in which compilations of chant of the liturgical year are taken apart and rearranged, not in liturgical order, but rather in musical order, according to the 8 church modes. The earliest of these documents, the St. Rinque fragment, dates from the late 8th, early 9th century, and firmly situates the development of tonaries within the same time period as the development of Gregorian chant itself. Indeed, these documents seem to be, like chant, an outgrowth of the greater Carolingian project. Many musicology scholars for a long time, particularly Huglo and David Hiley, have suggested that these tonaries function primarily as like didactic or teaching tools, in that they were just laying out the modes. And if they were used practically, it was probably more for very specific cases of trying to find the right chant to fit with the right antiphon or something like that. However, recent musicological scholarship by Anna-Marie Buseberger suggests that tonaries may also have a mnemonic function, that there's a kind of structure which allowed for chant recall built into the way tonaries are organized. However, she still says that this mnemonic function is predicated on the use of notation, as well as the use of kind of a meta-level organizational system. However, that lends to a sort of a problem, because the earliest tonaries aren't notated, and yet they're, quite extant. They don't have a lot of explanations. They just expect whoever's reading them to know what's going on. Why is that? Why would the St. Rinque fragment exist in this manner? Well, to kind of give you an example of what it does give us, this is the first page of it. The fragment's in the back of a psalter. As you can see, it's unnotated. You have the mode up top. It's ordered according to the older mode of ordering modal systems, in that it's not numbered, but rather you have your ordinal number, and then it's subdivided into whether it's authentic or plagal. You have the incipits for the chant, as well as a little abbreviation to show you which chant it is, whether it's an offertory or whatnot. Now, what's intriguing about this, and many scholars have noted this fact, is one, it shows us that the modal system was already established in the Carolingian area as early as the late 8th century, maybe even earlier. Two, there's no explanation, they just give it. And so we can assume that they expected the audience to understand what the modal system is for. And three, it's relatively stabilized. That is to say, if one looks at a later tonary, like the Dijon tonary, which is approximately 250 years later than this one finds the same attribution of chants to the same modes. So you could pick an offertory from this and find it at the exact same place in the later tonary. I wish to suggest that what this tells us is that modal theory itself has a unique function. And this functionality explains the great pains that theorists took to incorporate it into their chant tradition, indeed into the very musical character of Gregorian chant itself, which is often defined in relation to its modality as a unique development compared to other kinds of chant rites, such as Old Roman or Milanese chant. I posit that this unique, as McKinnon calls it, tonal quality is very intentional in the features of Gregorian chant, and it remains a testament to the importance of modal qualities for the Carolingian chant project. The other indication being the readiness of Carolingian theorists, especially later Carolingian theorists, to amend the Gregorian melodies in order to have them better fit with the modal system. As theorist Atkinson realized, this tendency opens a number of questions, but perhaps the most fundamental is why they would amend these melodies that were supposed to be sacred. The answer to these questions is that modal theory itself served as a mnemonic aid for the transmission and retention of chant repertoire. To support this claim, I turn to the insightful study by Richard Crocker, and where he discusses kind of the vital quality of tonal and pitch centricity in monophonic music. He suggests that the vital quality of monophonic music is that tonal space is readily audible to the listener and the performer, since, in monophonic music, all structural importance exists at the surface level, thus providing the listener with more direct access to the music as such. As Crocker had argued elsewhere, the melodies of Gregorian chant were in fact, contrary to popular belief, the easiest parts of chant to remember. According to him, this is why early notation was more concerned with contour and phrasing rather than the specifics of pitch. This ease of remembering, according to Crocker, is immediately, intimately related to chant's direct presentation of pitch space. The full impact of these ideas can be summarized in this telling quote in which he says, quote, A melody generates tonal space by moving through a range of pitches. A reciting pitch, in contrast, does not generate a space, but rather just a place to be. By dwelling on one pitch, the reciting pitch seems to be a point, a sharply defined location in an otherwise undefined expanse. In comparison, the tonal space generated by melodies are less well defined than a reciting pitch, but still, they are readily audible. Awareness of tonal space is easily heightened, and even when we are not aware of it, tonal space is a principal source of the musical meaning of Gregorian chant. He is describing tonal space as a kind of site of musical meaning, but more importantly, he calls this pitch centricity, this focus around certain tones, as a place to be. Here, I argue, lies the importance of modal theory for Carolingian scholars. For the resonance between Crocker's statement and Carruthers' earlier statement that, quote, composition begins with clearly and deliberately locating oneself in a place, which may be an actual location, but most importantly conceived of as a mental position, both a habitation and the mind and a direction. This resonance, I believe, is very telling. It shows that the memorial act that precedes composition or performance constituted first in situating oneself in a place or a mental location from whence the appropriate memories could be drawn or reconstructed depending on the context. This location was not merely the specific information or material that was needed to be recalled, but rather an abstraction in which and from which the subject could orientate themselves towards the relevant material, simultaneously providing the mental hooks to recall the material, as well as an abstract framework in which to reconstruct it. This is what the modes do for music. As already noted, the Frankish version of modal theory was more of an abstraction, not merely a catalog of melody traits, but a systemization of the common structural principles of chant. Further, this systemization was not merely classificatory, but also productive. For, as Atkinson noted, they were quite willing to amend and adjust sacred melodies in order to bring it in line with the system. These steps were taken because, as Crocker so eloquently pointed out, the modal system creates a sense of a place to be, an abstract musical location in which, once the subject is oriented, the rest of the musical composition could be reconstructed. Thus, to draw the connection even more directly, modality became the musical equivalent of the locus in ars memoria, a mental space or place or room in which the details that needed to be recalled could be attached, like hooks or honey. I argue that this mnemonic concern, this memorial functionality, underlies the process of chant tonification, the creation of Gregorian chant's uniquely tonal qualities in the Carolingian era, which has been recognized by many scholars, yet often only in passing. It also answers our initial question concerning the unnotated tonaries, for it shows that indeed the tonaries operated at two mnemonic levels. On the first level, they provide, as Buseberger has argued, a kind of hierarchy classificatory scheme that organizes chant around some musical property, in this case modality. On the second level, the musical property itself acts as a mnemonic, allowing the cantor to reconstruct the specific properties of a given chant in relation to a modal locus. Hence, notation was not necessary for the tonary phenomenon, though certainly related to it. Further, this kind of memorial process is unique compared to the standard use of ars memoria. As Carruthers has documented, medieval sources tend to construct memorial loci which are personalized, right? The suggestion is always that if you're making some sort of memorial system, it needs to be something that is subjective to you, that is personally involved with your life, so you can remember it better. Yet, this is standardized at the modal level, though interestingly not necessarily at others. In this way, we can see a unifying point between the cultural practice of chant and its musical foundation. For modality then becomes the corporate oral memory of chant, not just for the performer who uses it as a practical mnemonic aid by which they're better able to construct and reconstruct melodies, but for the audience as well. The modal sound of chant is not a private location in some sort of hermeneutical system, but rather a public location where both the listener and performer can find themselves and thus find each other. Again, to quote Crocker in conclusion, under certain conditions, Gregorian chant, is a powerful kind of sound that shows the power of musical tone to involve the listener vicariously in performance. To be in the presence of this sound is to participate in it. Listening and singing become one. This then becomes the cultural power of modality. It opens up a musical space that resolves the larger concerns of Christian identity vis-a-vis a copious public memory, which in both the performer and listener, they can find a place. Thus, in Chant, we find a unification of the collective and the subjective memory, a unification that allows for both the subject and the group to perform their Christian identity. Thank you.